The guest arrived and left no plate untouched. Welcome to the Silent Clueworks. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Comment below with where you're listening from. I always treasure your thoughts. Let's step into the mystery. If you want to see a 1/7 of a ton man register personal affront, try interrupting his lunch with news that someone has been tampering with his spice cabinet. I learned this on a Thursday in March, when what should have been a perfectly ordinary afternoon turned into something that would keep us busy for the next week. It started, as these things often do, with Fritz looking worried. Fritz Brenner, Wolfe's chef and the only man I know who can make a souffle rise through sheer force of personality. He appeared in the office doorway at 2:15 with the expression of someone who discovered a fly in his soup. If Fritz ever served soup with flies in it, which would happen approximately when Wolfe took up jogging. "Archie," he said, his accent making my name sound like a minor emergency. "Someone has been in my kitchen." I looked up from the germination records I was updating, a task about as thrilling as watching paint dry in slow motion. Wolfe was at his desk, leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed, digesting lunch and probably contemplating the cosmic significance of the sweetbreads Fritz had prepared. The mention of kitchen intrusion got one eye open. "Explain," Wolfe said, without moving anything except his lips. Fritz twisted his hands in his apron. "This morning, when I prepared the veal stock, I used the saffron from the small jar on the second shelf, the good saffron from Spain, but now—" He stopped, looking genuinely distressed. "Now it is not saffron in that jar." Both of Wolfe's eyes opened. "What is it?" "Turmeric. Good turmeric, but turmeric. Someone has replaced the saffron with turmeric and taken the jar." I put down my pen. In the hierarchy of household disasters, this ranked somewhere between discovering the orchids had aphids and learning that beer had been declared illegal. Wolfe's spice collection was sacred territory, assembled over years with the care most people reserve for their children's college funds. "When did you last use the saffron?" Wolfe asked. "Tuesday. For the rice pilaf. It was saffron then, I'm certain." "Who has been in the house since Tuesday?" Fritz considered this. "Yesterday, the man to read the gas meter. Today, Miss Rowan came to return the book you lent her, and this morning, the woman about the dinner." "What woman about what dinner?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was heading. Fritz looked at me as if I'd forgotten my own name. "The woman who called Tuesday, Miss Carstairs. She came this morning to discuss the menu for the dinner party she wishes you to cater." Wolfe made a sound like a water buffalo with indigestion. "I do not cater. I've told you this repeatedly." "Yes, sir. But she was very persuasive. She said it was for a private dinner, only 6 people, and she would pay very well for you to prepare one meal in her home. She brought samples of her spices and oils for you to approve." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a sedative. Now Wolfe stared at Fritz with the expression of a man who just learned that his trusted lieutenant had been selling state secrets. "You allowed a stranger to bring foreign spices into my kitchen?" "She seemed very respectable," Fritz said weakly, "and she knew about food. She spoke of saffron grades and harvest seasons." I was already reaching for my notebook. "Fritz, describe this woman." "Tall, perhaps 40 years old, dark hair, very neat. She wore a blue dress and carried a leather case with the spice samples. She had good hands, a cook's hands." "Did she give you a card? An address?" "She said she would call back today to discuss the arrangements." The phone rang as if summoned. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. "Mr. Goodwin?" The voice was crisp, professional, with just a trace of nervousness underneath. "This is Helen Carstairs. I spoke with your chef yesterday about catering a dinner party. I'm calling to finalize the arrangements." I looked at Wolfe, who was watching me with the intensity of a cat at a mouse hole. I covered the mouthpiece. "It's her." Wolfe gestured for me to continue. "Miss Carstairs, I said. "There seems to be a small problem. When you visited this morning, did you happen to take anything from the kitchen?" The pause was long enough to drive a truck through. "I don't understand." "Someone substituted turmeric for saffron in one of our spice jars. Since you're the only person who's been near the spices recently, we thought you might have some insight." Another pause, shorter this time. "Mr. Goodwin, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. Now, it's not about catering. It's about murder." I raised my eyebrows at Wolfe, who was now sitting forward in his chair like a mountain deciding to relocate. "Murder," I repeated. "Yes. And if someone has been tampering with spices in Mr. Wolfe's kitchen, then I'm afraid the killer knows I've come to you for help." Wolfe reached for his beer glass, drained it, and set it down with the deliberate care of a man making a decision. "Archie, tell Miss Carstairs to come here immediately, and tell her to bring whatever she took from my kitchen. It appears we have a case." I uncovered the mouthpiece. "Miss Carstairs, you'd better get over here right now and bring that saffron." Miss Carstairs arrived 34 minutes later, which gave Wolfe time to finish his beer and me time to consider whether we were dealing with a clever thief, or a desperate woman, or both. When the doorbell rang, I went to answer it and got my first look at our saffron bandit. Fritz had been accurate, but incomplete in his description. She was tall, maybe 5'8", with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency over vanity. Her blue dress was well cut but not flashy, and she carried a leather briefcase that showed honest wear. What Fritz hadn't mentioned were her eyes, gray, intelligent, and currently showing the strain of someone who'd been running on nerves and coffee for too long. "Miss Carstairs," I said, stepping aside, "you made good time." "Mr. Goodwin." Her voice was steadier than it had been on the phone, but I caught the slight tremor underneath. "Thank you for seeing me." I led her to the office, and where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain that had decided to take up permanent residence. She stopped just inside the doorway, and I watched her take his measure. Most people either cower or bristle when they first see Wolfe. She did neither. She simply assessed him with the same careful attention she might give to evaluating a rare spice. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I have your saffron." Wolfe inclined his head a fraction of an inch. "Sit down, Miss Carstairs. Place your case on the desk and explain why you found it necessary to commit burglary in order to discuss murder." She sat in the red leather chair and set her briefcase on Wolfe's blotter. From inside, she produced a familiar jar with Fritz's neat handwriting on the label. She placed it before Wolfe with the care of someone returning a sacred relic. I apologize for the deception," she said. "I needed to test something, and I needed your saffron to do it properly." "Test what?" Wolfe demanded. "Whether someone is trying to frame me for murder by contaminating spices." She folded her hands in her lap. "My name is Helen Carstairs. I'm a culinary consultant specializing in rare ingredients and historical food preparation. 3 days ago, my primary client died of what appeared to be a heart attack. It wasn't a heart attack. It was poison. And the weapon was saffron from my private stock." Wolfe's eyebrows rose a millimeter. "Continue." "The victim was Victor Ashford, the restaurant critic. He was also my business partner and the financial backer for my consulting firm. Tuesday evening, he hosted a private dinner at his apartment for 4 potential investors in a new restaurant venture. He insisted on preparing the main course himself, risotto alla Milanese. He was very particular about his saffron and kept a private supply that I had imported for him from La Mancha." I looked up from my notebook. "And you think someone doctored his private stock?" "I know they did." Her voice was flat, certain. "Wednesday morning, when I learned Victor was dead, I went to his apartment. The police hadn't sealed it yet. They saw no reason to treat it as a crime scene. I found his saffron tin in the kitchen. It looked normal, but when I examined it closely, the threads were wrong. Duller. The aroma was metallic instead of sweet." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "You removed evidence from the scene of a death." I removed evidence before it could be destroyed or overlooked, she corrected. The police had already ruled it a natural death. And Victor had a minor heart condition from years ago, and his doctor saw no reason to question the diagnosis. If I hadn't taken that tin, it would have been thrown away with the rest of his pantry. Where is this contaminated saffron now? Wolfe asked. In a safety deposit box at First National. I had it tested by a private lab yesterday. It's genuine Spanish saffron, but it's been adulterated with colchicine, extract from autumn crocus. The threads look identical to saffron if you're not examining them closely, but the poison is concentrated enough to kill within hours. I whistled softly. Colchicine was nasty stuff, a slow, agonizing death that could easily be mistaken for a heart attack if no one was looking for it. Who had access to Mr. Ashford's apartment? Wolfe inquired. Oh, that's where it gets complicated. She opened her briefcase again and withdrew a manila folder. The 4 dinner guests all arrived early and had cocktails while Victor finished cooking. Any of them could have slipped into the kitchen and switched the saffron. They were Marcus Webb, Victor's former business partner who's been trying to buy out his restaurant holdings. Dr. Patricia Vance, Victor's ex-wife and a food scientist who knew exactly how much saffron would be lethal. James Ashford, Victor's nephew and heir, who's been desperate for money to cover gambling debts. And Lila Rowan. At that name, I sat up straight. Lila Rowan was at this dinner. Carstairs turned to me, her eyes sharpening. You know her? She was here yesterday, I said, returning a book she'd borrowed from Sir Wolfe 2 weeks ago. The color drained from her face. Then they know I've come to you. Explain, Wolfe commanded. Lila and I were friends. Close friends. She knew about my work with Victor, knew about the restaurant project, knew I was the one who supplied his saffron. After Victor died, I was devastated. I told her I suspected murder and that I was going to hire a private detective. She tried to talk me out of it, said it would only make me look guilty. When I insisted, she asked who I planned to hire. I told her I was thinking of consulting you. Wolfe's expression had gone from annoyed to genuinely interested. Miss Rowan borrowed The Physiology of Taste from my library. She returned it yesterday, the day after Mr. Ashford's death. She's never shown any interest in food writing, Carstairs said quietly. And she's a fashion photographer. The only reason she'd borrow that book would be to have an excuse to come here and see if I'd actually contacted you. And when she confirmed that you hadn't, I added, she knew you were still just thinking about it. But now I have contacted you, she said, and if she's involved in Victor's death, she'll know I'm a threat. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced over his middle. When he opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the jar of saffron she'd returned. You stole my saffron to replace what you'd taken from the crime scene, he said. You needed to maintain the illusion that nothing had been disturbed until you could prove your suspicions. Yes, and I needed to test whether you were as observant as your reputation suggests. And if someone is killing people by contaminating spices, they need access to their target's kitchen and the knowledge to choose exactly the right moment. I had to know if you could detect that kind of intrusion. Fritz detected it within hours, Wolfe said dryly, which means you're exactly the man I need. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Wolfe, someone murdered Victor to destroy our business partnership and frame me for his death. They're counting on the police accepting the natural death ruling and never looking deeper. If they succeed, I'll be ruined even if I'm never formally charged. My reputation, my business, my entire career will be destroyed by whispers and suspicion. Wolfe reached for his beer glass, found it empty, and grimaced. What do you want from me, Miss Carstairs? I want you to prove Victor was murdered. I want you to identify his killer, and I want you to do it before they decide I know too much and arrange for me to have an unfortunate accident with contaminated spices. Wolfe closed his eyes again. I knew what he was thinking. The case involved food, poison, and someone who'd violated the sanctity of his kitchen by proxy. It was personal now, whether he wanted it to be or not. Plus, There was the intellectual challenge of a murder weapon that looked identical to its innocent counterpart. "Very well," he said, opening his eyes. "My fee is $25,000 plus expenses. You will provide complete documentation regarding Mr. Ashford's business dealings, his relationship with each suspect, and a detailed timeline of Tuesday evening's dinner party. You will also surrender the contaminated saffron for my examination." "Agreed," she said without hesitation. "Furthermore, you will do exactly as I instruct. You will not contact the police without my permission. You will maintain your normal routine as much as possible, and you will answer every question I ask without evasion or omission." "I understand." "Good. Archie, show Miss Carstairs out and then call Saul Panzer. We'll need him tomorrow to begin surveillance of our 4 suspects. He turned his gaze back to Carstairs. "And Miss Carstairs, if Miss Rowan contacts you, you will inform me immediately. If she killed once to protect her secret, she won't hesitate to kill again." As I escorted her to the front door, she paused in the hallway. "Mr. Goodwin, do you think he'll solve it?" "Lady," I said, opening the door, "you just handed him a murder weapon that doubles as a cooking ingredient and a killer who violated his kitchen by proxy. He's not going to let that slide. Your Victor Ashford is going to get justice, and whoever poisoned him is going to regret the day they decided to mess with saffron in Nero Wolfe's neighborhood." After I closed the door behind Helen Carstairs, I found Wolfe in the office, motionless except for one finger rotating the recovered saffron jar like a prayer wheel. The silence stretched until I cleared my throat. "Instructions?" I asked, settling back at my desk. "Bring Fritz here first," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "I want his professional assessment of this substitution. Then call Saul Panzer for tomorrow morning and arrange surveillance on our 4 suspects." I found Fritz in the kitchen, one where he was channeling his anxiety into the systematic destruction of vegetables for dinner. When I told him Wolfe wanted to see him, he wiped his hands with the resignation of a man walking to his own execution. In the office, Wolfe handed him the jar. "Examine this carefully, Fritz. Tell me everything you observe." Fritz unscrewed the lid and bent over the contents with the concentration of a jeweler examining diamonds. He lifted a few threads, rubbed them between his fingers, brought them close to his nose. After a full minute of this ritual, he looked up with a frown. "This is the saffron that was taken," he said. "Spanish from La Mancha, grade 1. The color is correct, the aroma is correct, but—" He paused, his frown deepening. "It has been handled recently. The threads are slightly compressed, as if someone transferred them from one container to another and back again. Also, there are traces of another scent, very faint. Metallic." "Could you detect such handling if you weren't specifically looking for it?" Wolfe asked. Fritz considered this carefully. "Perhaps not immediately, but when cooking, yes. The threads would not separate properly in liquid. A careful cook would notice within minutes. And Mr. Ashford was a careful cook. Miss Carstairs said he was particular about his saffron. Such a man would know his ingredients." Wolfe nodded slowly, which means the killer took a calculated risk. Either Mr. Ashford was too distracted to notice the substitution, or they were confident their preparation would pass inspection. He turned his massive head toward Fritz. "When you use saffron in risotto, at what point do you add it?" "Near the beginning, dissolved in warm broth or wine. It must steep to release the color and flavor properly. A good risotto takes 25 minutes minimum. So Mr. Ashford would have added the poisoned saffron early in the cooking process." "Yes, sir. And if he tasted as he cooked, which any serious cook does, he would have begun ingesting the poison long before the meal was served to his guests." I saw where this was heading, which means all 4 dinner guests could have eaten the finished risotto safely, while Ashford was already dying from the doses he'd consumed during preparation. "Precisely." Wolfe dismissed Fritz with a nod. The killer understood both the cooking process and the poison's pharmacology. They knew Ashford would taste repeatedly while cooking, like ensuring a lethal dose before the meal began. The guests would receive only minimal exposure, perhaps enough for mild discomfort, but nothing fatal or immediately suspicious. "That's cold," I said, watching him cook his own death while making cocktails conversation. "It's methodical," Wolfe corrected, which suggests someone with both knowledge and considerable nerve. The phone rang before I could respond. I picked up. Nero Wolfe's office. "Archie?" The voice was familiar, warm, with an undertone that I now recognized as carefully controlled anxiety. "Lila Rowan." I covered the mouthpiece and mouthed her name to Wolfe, who gestured for me to continue. "Miss Rowan," I said. "What a pleasant surprise." "Is it?" A pause. "I was calling because I heard something disturbing. Helen Carstairs came to see Mr. Wolfe this afternoon. News travels fast in your circle. Helen and I were friends. She called me an hour ago, very upset, saying she'd hired Mr. Wolfe to investigate Victor's death. She seemed to think I had something to do with it." "Did you?" The pause stretched long enough to drive a truck through. "That's not amusing, Archie. Victor died of a heart attack. The police confirmed it. Helen is grief-stricken and looking for someone to blame. And you're worried she'll blame you." "I'm worried she'll make wild accusations that hurt innocent people. We were Victor's friends, Archie. We're mourning him." I glanced at Wolfe, who was listening with his eyes closed. "Miss Rowan, if you're concerned about false accusations, perhaps you should discuss it with Mr. Wolfe directly." "I don't think that's necessary." "Saturday lunch," I interrupted smoothly. 1 o'clock. Mr. Wolfe would appreciate the opportunity to hear your perspective." Another pause, and I could practically hear her calculating odds. "I'll be there." She hung up without saying goodbye. I replaced the receiver and looked at Wolfe. She's scared, and smart enough to know that refusing would look suspicious. Fear makes people careless. Wolfe stood, a process involving considerable effort. "Call Saul for 9 tomorrow morning. Tonight you will visit Mr. Webb at his restaurant. I want to know his reaction when you mention contaminated spices." An hour later, I was standing in the dim elegance of Le Miroir, where Marcus Webb held court from a back office that smelled of expensive cigars and barely contained ambition. And he was a thick-set man with aggressive features and small, calculating eyes that sized me up like I was a cut of meat he was considering for purchase. "Who are you?" he barked without standing. "I'm busy." "Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. We've been retained to investigate the circumstances of Victor Ashford's death." Webb's laugh was short and sharp. "Circumstances? The man's ticker gave out. He was 62 and ate like Henry VIII. "What circumstances?" "Our client thinks it might have been something he ate. Specifically, the saffron in his risotto." Webb's pen stopped moving. "Helen, I knew that woman was unhinged. She's trying to stall the estate settlement, isn't she? Once probate clears, and I'm buying out Victor's share and turning this place into something profitable." "So you admit you wanted him out of the way?" "I admit I'm a businessman. Victor was a romantic who held us back with his precious, authentic recipes and imported ingredients. But I didn't kill him, Goodwin. I was sitting at his table when he collapsed." Before I could press further, the office door burst open. A young man in an expensive suit that fit him like a flour sack stumbled in, pale and sweating with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. "Marcus, you have to sign the release forms," he said, ignoring me entirely. "The bank called again. They're threatening to freeze everything." "Get out, James," Webb snapped. "I'm busy with a private investigator." James Ashford froze, turning to stare at me. "Private investigator? What for?" "Mr. Goodwin thinks your uncle was poisoned," Webb said with cruel amusement. "Something about tampered spices." The color drained from James's face. He grabbed the back of a chair for support. "That's insane. Who would You look nervous, Mr. Ashford," I observed. "Gambling debts coming due." James looked from me to Webb, panic flaring in his eyes. I didn't. I was in the living room the whole time. Ask Lila. She saw me. Lila Rowan? She's your alibi. We were talking about her photography work. He stammered. She was showing me pictures on her phone. Webb snorted. You were begging her for money, just like you begged Victor, and when he refused, you went into the kitchen for more ice. I remember that clearly. I needed ice. James's voice cracked. I didn't touch anything else. But you were in the kitchen, I pressed. While the risotto was cooking, while the saffron was accessible. James looked ready to collapse. I wasn't the only one. Dr. Vance went in before me. She said she wanted to check the wine Victor was using for cooking. She had her medical bag with her. Her medical bag? A big leather case. She carries it everywhere, and she hated Uncle Victor, Mr. Goodwin. Really hated him. She once told me that a man who cared more about his stomach than his marriage deserved to choke on his own gluttony. I made a mental note to have a conversation with Dr. Patricia Vance very soon. Where can I find the good doctor now? The university, James said, wiping sweat from his forehead. She works late in her lab, but don't tell her I said anything. She scares me more than the bookies. I left them glaring at each other and headed for the nearest phone booth. The circle of suspects wasn't just taking shape. It was revealing itself as a nest of vipers, each with access to the kitchen, motive for murder, and secrets worth killing to protect. Dr. Vance was looking more interesting by the minute, and I had a feeling her late-night laboratory work might provide exactly the chemical expertise our killer had needed. The game was definitely afoot, and tomorrow's surveillance was going to be very illuminating indeed. Dr. Patricia Vance's laboratory occupied the basement of Columbia's Life Sciences building, a sterile maze of humming equipment and chemical odors that made me grateful for my liberal arts education. And I found her bent over a microscope in a room that looked like it could synthesize everything from aspirin to atomic bombs, depending on her mood. She was a lean woman in her late 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back so severely it probably required engineering consultation. When I knocked on the doorframe, she looked up with the expression of someone who'd spent years dissecting things and wouldn't mind adding me to her collection. Dr. Vance, Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. She straightened slowly, removing safety glasses with deliberate precision. The detective. So Helen finally went through with her melodramatic theory. You knew she was planning to hire us. She came to my office Wednesday morning in hysterics, claiming Victor had been poisoned. I told her she was being ridiculous. Vance crossed her arms. Victor had a documented heart condition and the dietary habits of a Roman emperor. His death was unfortunate, but entirely predictable. Predictable enough that someone might have helped it along with colchicine disguised as saffron? The chemical name hit her like a physical blow. Her pupils contracted slightly before she regained control. Colchicine is an alkaloid derived from autumn crocus. Highly toxic, symptoms mimic cardiac arrest perfectly. But knowing the pharmacology doesn't make me a murderer, Mr. Goodwin. According to James Ashford, you brought your medical bag to the dinner and went into the kitchen twice. Once to help Victor with a spill, once to check his cooking wine. James is a desperate boy drowning in gambling debts. He'd blame his own mother if it might save his skin. She set her glasses down with a sharp click. Yes, I went into the kitchen. Victor was already showing signs of distress. Sweating, nausea, trembling hands. I thought he was having an angina attack and went to get nitroglycerin from my emergency kit. He refused to take it, said it was just heat from the stove. But you had access to his spices. I had access to everything in that kitchen, just like the other 4 guests. But if I wanted Victor dead, I wouldn't have used something as crude as colchicine in front of witnesses. I would have done it years ago, quietly, when we were still married and no one would have questioned a heart attack. She opened a desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder. However, if you're looking for motive and opportunity, you might want to examine these. She handed me several pages of financial documents. Victor showed me these 2 weeks ago. Now he was dissolving his partnership with Marcus Webb to form a new venture with Helen Carstairs. Webb stood to lose everything: the restaurant, his investment, his reputation. I scanned the numbers. Webb was leveraged to his eyeballs, and Victor's death meant the partnership continued under terms that let Webb buy out the estate at a fraction of market value. It was a motive worth millions. Why would Victor consult you about business matters? Because Helen's proposal involved historically authentic spice blends marketed through high-end restaurants. Victor wanted my opinion on the chemistry and preservation methods. Vance paused. I also told him to be careful. Webb has a reputation for playing rough when money gets personal. Did you mention this to the police? The police ruled it natural death. They weren't interested in business disputes. She met my eyes directly. But I'll tell you something else. When I went into the kitchen the second time, I saw Lila Rowan coming out. She was holding something small, a jar or container. When she saw me, she slipped it into her purse very quickly and immediately engaged James in conversation, keeping him occupied in the living room. Creating alibis, or covering her tracks. Lila and Helen were close friends until about 6 months ago. Then something changed. They stopped speaking entirely. Helen never told me why, but I got the impression it involved Victor. Before I could press further, a graduate student with more beard than sense poked his head through the door. Dr. Vance, security called about the hazardous materials inventory. They say we're missing a vial of colchicine from the restricted cabinet. The color drained from Vance's face. She gripped the edge of her workbench until her knuckles went white. That's impossible. Everything is logged and locked. They want to see you in the security office, the student said, then disappeared. Vance stared after him, her scientific composure cracking. This is either the worst coincidence in history, or someone is trying to frame me. Any idea who might have access to your lab? The restricted cabinet requires 2 keys and a security code. Only 3 people have access: myself, my research assistant, and the department head. She grabbed her coat. Mr. Goodwin, I may be Victor's ex-wife, but I'm not his killer. Just someone is using my expertise against me. I left her to deal with security and headed back to the brownstone where I found Wolfe in his office with the recovered saffron jar, rotating it like a prayer wheel. When I finished my report, including the missing colchicine and the financial documents, he sat in silence for a long moment. The missing vial is either genuine theft or elaborate staging, he finally said. Either Dr. Vance is innocent and someone stole from her supply, or she's guilty in creating false evidence to deflect suspicion. There's something else, I said, and told him about the insurance policy Vance had mentioned. Wolfe's eyes opened. Miss Carstairs failed to mention that significant detail. Most instructive. The phone rang before he could elaborate. It was Saul Panzer with his first surveillance report. Marcus Webb had left his apartment at dawn and gone directly to a coffee shop 3 blocks from Victor Ashford's building, where he'd met a woman matching Lila Rowan's description. They'd talked for 20 minutes. Webb had handed her an envelope. Then they'd separated. Get photographs if they meet again, Wolfe instructed when I relayed this, and determine what was in that envelope. After I hung up, Wolfe leaned back in his chair. We have financial desperation, scientific expertise, mysterious meetings, and missing poison. The circle tightens, Archie. Someone among our suspects is growing nervous. Nervous enough to make mistakes. Or desperate enough to eliminate witnesses. He picked up the saffron jar again. Tomorrow's lunch with Miss Rowan becomes even more critical. We need to know what happened 6 months ago between her and Miss Carstairs, and we need to understand her role in that kitchen. I was about to respond when Fritz appeared in the doorway, looking more agitated than I'd seen him since someone had suggested he use margarine instead of butter. Mr. Wolfe, he said, wringing his hands in his apron, I'm sorry to disturb you, but someone has been in the plant rooms. The orchids. Someone has touched them. Wolfe went rigid. An attack on his spice collection was serious. An invasion of his orchid sanctuary was personal. Explain. This afternoon, while you were both out, I went to check the Cattle-Yar Alliance. The humidity levels were wrong, and some of the plants had been moved. Very slightly, but moved. And there was this. He held up a small white envelope, for it was pinned to the Brassola Eliocattleya Helen. Wolfe took the envelope with the care of someone handling a live grenade. Inside was a single typed line. Curiosity killed more than cats. Leave well enough alone. The silence stretched until I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. Someone had violated the sanctity of Wolfe's most private space, and they'd done it to deliver a threat. It was the kind of mistake that transformed Nero Wolfe from a sedentary detective into an implacable force of nature. "Fritz," Wolfe said quietly. "Call Miss Carstairs. Tell her to come here immediately. Then call the others, Webb, Ashford, Dr. Vance, and Miss Rowan. We're having a dinner party tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. "What should I tell them about the menu?" Fritz asked. Wolfe's smile was thin and dangerous. "It's a risotto alla Milanese, with the finest Spanish saffron." As Fritz hurried away to make the calls, I looked at my employer. "You're going to serve them the same dish that killed Ashford." "Indeed. It will be instructive to observe who refuses to eat." His eyes were cold as winter. "Someone violated my home, Archie. They threatened me in my own sanctuary. That was their final mistake." The game had just become personal, and I almost felt sorry for whoever had been foolish enough to invade Nero Wolfe's orchid rooms. Almost, but not quite. They'd killed once already, and now they were threatening us. Tomorrow's dinner party was going to be very interesting indeed. The question was whether we'd catch our killer before they decided that a private detective and his assistant were just 2 more ingredients in their deadly recipe. By 9 the next morning, the brownstone had taken on the atmosphere of a fortress preparing for siege. Wolfe had spent an hour in the plant rooms with Theodore, checking every orchid for damage and restoring the precise arrangements that someone had dared to disturb. The violation had transformed his usual morning routine from contemplative to coldly methodical. I was at my desk updating surveillance schedules when Helen Carstairs arrived, looking like she'd spent the night wrestling with demons instead of sleeping. Fritz showed her in, and I noticed her hands were steadier than her voice when she spoke. "Mr. Wolfe, I've brought additional information you'll need." She set a manila folder on his desk. "About Victor's insurance policies and business arrangements. You signed about Lila Rowan." Wolfe emerged from behind his newspaper like a mountain deciding to pay attention. "Proceed." Victor carried a substantial life insurance policy, $500,000, with me as beneficiary. It was standard business practice when we formed our partnership. But there's something else. She paused, gathering herself. 6 months ago, I discovered that Lila was having an affair with Victor. I found them together at his apartment. "Your reaction?" Wolfe inquired. "I told Victor it had to end if he wanted to continue our business relationship. He agreed. I thought it was finished." Her voice tightened. "But 2 weeks ago, I saw them together again at a gallery opening. They were standing very close, whispering like conspirators. When they noticed me watching, they separated immediately." I looked up from my notes. "Nears, that would explain the falling out between you and Miss Rowan." "It would explain more than that," Helen said grimly. "Victor was planning something. He'd become secretive about his meetings, evasive about the restaurant project's timeline. I think he was preparing to dissolve our partnership entirely and start fresh with Lila." Before Wolfe could respond, the doorbell rang. I went to answer it and found Lila Rowan on the stoop, a full day early for her scheduled lunch appointment and looking like someone who'd been running on nerves and coffee since Tuesday. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately," she said without preamble. "It's about the threats." I showed her in, and the temperature in the office dropped 20 degrees when she and Helen locked eyes. Lila stopped just inside the doorway, her usual poise deserting her. Helen, she said quietly. I didn't expect you to be here. Apparently there are many things you didn't expect, Helen replied with Arctic precision. Wolfe cleared his throat with the subtle authority of a judge calling court to order. Miss Rowan, you're early for our appointment. I assume you have urgent information. Lila's hands twisted her purse strap. Someone's been following me since Wednesday. This morning I found this in my mailbox. She handed me an envelope identical to the one Fritz had discovered in the plant rooms. Inside was another typed message. Silence is golden. Conversation is fatal. Wolfe examined both notes, comparing paper and typeface. When did you receive this? This morning, after Marcus Webb met me at a coffee shop and gave me an envelope full of cash, telling me to leave town for a few weeks. She looked directly at Helen. He knows about Victor and me. He said if I testified about what I saw in the kitchen Tuesday night, he'd make sure everyone knew about our relationship and that I had motive to kill Victor for inheritance rights. Inheritance rights? I asked sharply. Victor's will leaves me his apartment and personal effects. We were going to be married after... She stopped, glancing at Helen's stony expression. After what, Miss Rowan? Wolfe pressed. After he finalized some business arrangements. He said there were complications with existing partnerships that needed resolution first. Helen's laugh was bitter. His divorce was finalized 3 years ago, Lila. He was free to marry anyone, any time. If he didn't marry you, it's because he was stringing you along while he figured out how to profit from the situation. The phone rang, cutting through the tension. It was Saul Panzer with his morning surveillance report. Marcus Webb had left his apartment at dawn and gone directly to the coffee shop where he'd met Lila. After she left, he'd walked 3 blocks to Dr. Vance's building and had what appeared to be a heated conversation with her on the street before handing her an envelope similar to the one he'd given Lila. 2 payments, 2 threats, I reported to Wolfe after hanging up. Someone's coordinating a cover-up. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed in thought. Miss Rowan, you mentioned seeing something in the kitchen Tuesday night. What exactly did you witness? Lila took a shaky breath. I went to get more wine around 7:30. Now Patricia Vance was standing by the stove with her medical bag open, holding a small vial and looking at the risotto pot. When she heard me, she closed the bag quickly and said she was checking Victor's blood pressure medication. But I'd watched Victor earlier. He'd been careful to close the saffron tin after using it. When I looked again, it was open on the counter. Why didn't you mention this to the police? I demanded. Because Patricia threatened me. She said if I mentioned seeing her in the kitchen, she'd make sure everyone knew about my affair with Victor and destroy my reputation. Lila's voice cracked. I was scared and confused, and Victor was dying, and I just wanted it all to go away. Wolfe opened his eyes fully. But now Mr. Webb is paying you to leave town, and someone is sending you threatening notes. So the situation has escalated beyond your control. Yes, and I'm terrified I'm next. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, his fingers interlaced over his considerable middle. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Very well. Tonight we will have a dinner party. All suspects will attend. You, Miss Carstairs, Mr. Webb, Mr. James Ashford, and Dr. Vance. Fritz will prepare risotto alla Milanese using saffron from the contaminated tin Miss Carstairs recovered. Both women stared at him in horror. You can't serve poisoned food, Helen whispered. We will not consume it, Wolfe said curtly. But our killer cannot afford to have that evidence under my roof, still potent and identifiable. They must either destroy it, attempt to contaminate something else, or expose themselves trying to prevent its use. The dinner invitation will force their hand. After both women left, separately and without speaking, I turned to Wolfe. You really think this will flush out our killer? Someone violated my orchid rooms to deliver a threat, Archie. They made this personal. His eyes were cold as winter steel. Tomorrow evening, they will discover that threatening Nero Wolfe in his own home was their final mistake. I reached for the phone to call Saul with updated instructions. The game was accelerating, and our killer was about to learn that cornering Nero Wolfe was like trapping a mountain. Possible in theory, but inadvisable in practice. Saturday dawned with a kind of crisp November clarity that made you think the world had been washed and pressed overnight. And the brownstone hummed with purposeful activity as we prepared for what Fritz kept calling the dinner of judgment in tones that suggested he was catering the Last Supper. Saul Panzer arrived at 9 sharp with his surveillance report, settling into the red leather chair with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent a productive night watching other people make mistakes. Wolfe emerged from behind his morning paper like a mountain, deciding to pay attention to weather reports. "Proceed," Wolfe commanded, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Webb's been busy," Saul began, consulting his notebook. "Yesterday evening he made 3 stops after our last conversation. First to his lawyer's office. Stayed 40 minutes, came out looking like he'd swallowed a live toad. Second to a safety deposit box at First National, and where he withdrew a manila envelope. Third to Dr. Vance's building, where they had what looked like a heated discussion on the street corner." "The envelope?" I asked. "Changed hands." She took it, he left. But here's the interesting part. After Webb drove away, she didn't go back inside. She walked 6 blocks to a pharmacy and bought a bottle of antacid tablets. Then she went to a coffee shop and sat there for 2 hours, staring at whatever was in that envelope. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction. Fear or calculation? Both, I'd say. She kept checking her watch and looking around like she expected company that never showed. The phone rang before Wolfe could respond. It was Helen Carstairs, and her voice carried the brittle control of someone who'd spent the night staring at the ceiling. "Mr. Wolfe, but I need to tell you something before tonight. About the insurance policy I mentioned. There's more to it than I said." "Come here immediately," Wolfe instructed, then hung up without ceremony. She arrived 20 minutes later, looking like she'd dressed in the dark and forgotten to check mirrors. Fritz showed her in, and I noticed her hands were steadier than her voice when she spoke. "The insurance policy," she began without preamble. "It wasn't just standard business coverage. Victor increased it to $500,000 3 months ago, right after he and Lila resumed their relationship. He told me it was to protect our business investment, but now I think he was planning something else entirely." "Such as?" Wolfe inquired. "I think he was going to dissolve our partnership and marry Lila. The increased coverage would have given me compensation while leaving him free to start fresh with her money and connections." Her voice turned bitter. He was buying his way out of our agreement and his conscience simultaneously. Before Wolfe could respond, the doorbell chimed again. This time it was Dr. Patricia Vance, arriving unannounced and uninvited, carrying her medical bag and wearing the expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision during a sleepless night. "Mr. Wolfe," she said without waiting for invitation, "I understand you're serving risotto tonight. I came to warn you that someone may try to contaminate it." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a sedative. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a jeweler examining a suspicious diamond. "Explain your concern, Doctor Vance." "Last night, Marcus Webb approached me with a proposition. He offered me $50,000 to ensure that tonight's dinner would be memorable. He wanted me to introduce a mild gastric irritant into the food. Nothing fatal, just enough to make everyone sick and discredit your investigation." "Your response?" "I told him I wasn't interested in his schemes, but I'm afraid he may try to implement his plan through other means." She glanced at Helen, then back to Wolfe. "I also came to return this." She opened her medical bag and withdrew a small glass vial filled with white powder. "Colchicine extract. Someone placed this in my laboratory yesterday, probably hoping I'd be blamed when it was discovered missing from inventory. I'm returning it before accusations can be made." I took the vial, and noting that it was labeled in neat handwriting that didn't match Vance's prescription pad samples. Any idea who might have planted this? Someone with access to the chemistry building and knowledge of my work schedule. That could be any number of people, including other faculty members or graduate students. She paused. Or someone who obtained a key through less legitimate means. The phone rang again. This time it was Marcus Webb, and his voice carried the bluster of a man who decided offense was his best defense. "Wolfe, I'm calling to inform you that I won't be attending your little dinner party tonight. My lawyer has advised against it." "Your lawyer is wise," Wolfe replied calmly. "However, your absence will be noted and interpreted accordingly. I trust you understand the implications." The line went quiet for several seconds. Now, when Webb spoke again, his voice had lost its aggressive edge. "What kind of implications?" "The kind that interest district attorneys, Mr. Webb. 7 o'clock. Do not disappoint me." After he hung up, Wolfe turned to Dr. Vance. "Your warning is noted and appreciated. However, I suspect your real purpose in coming here was to gauge my knowledge of recent events and determine how much danger you face." Vance's composure cracked slightly. "I'm a scientist, Mr. Wolfe. I deal in facts and evidence. The fact is that someone is trying to frame me for Victor's murder, and I need to know if you believe their lies." "I believe in evidence, Dr. Vance. Tonight's dinner will provide ample opportunity to examine all the evidence in this case." After both women left, separately and without speaking, I found Wolfe in the kitchen with Fritz, examining the evening's preparations with the attention of a general reviewing battle plans. 2 identical saffron tins sat on the counter, one containing the contaminated threads Helen had recovered, the other Fritz's own precious supply. "The trap is set," Wolfe announced, lifting one tin and rotating it slowly. "Tonight, our killer will be forced to choose between allowing this evidence to remain in my possession or taking action to destroy it. Either choice will reveal their identity." "And if they choose violence instead of subtlety?" I asked. "Then we will be ready for them." He gestured toward the kitchen door, where I noticed Saul Panzer had positioned himself with a clear view of both entrances. "Our killer has been clever thus far, but desperation makes people careless. Tonight, desperation will be our ally." By 6:30, the dining room gleamed under Fritz's meticulous attention. The long mahogany table was set for 7 with Wolfe's best china and silver, each place setting arranged with mathematical precision. The atmosphere was elegant and civilized, which made the underlying tension all the more pronounced. The guests began arriving at 7, each bringing their own particular brand of nervous energy. James Ashford came first, twitching like a rabbit who'd wandered into a den of foxes. Marcus Webb followed, his usual bluster subdued, but his eyes sharp and calculating. Lila Rowan arrived precisely on time, pale but composed, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone walking a tightrope. Dr. Vance was last, her medical bag notably absent, her manner professionally cool despite the circumstances. I gathered them in the front room for cocktails, watching their interactions with the attention of a theater critic reviewing opening night. Webb and James avoided each other's eyes. Lila and Helen maintained Arctic silence. Dr. Vance positioned herself near the window as if calculating escape routes. At 7:30, Fritz appeared in the doorway with the solemn dignity of a funeral director. "Dinner is served." We moved to the dining room in a procession that felt more like a march to judgment than a social gathering. Wolfe took his place at the head of the table. I positioned myself at the foot, and our 5 suspects arranged themselves along the sides like pieces on a chessboard. Fritz entered with the first course, moving with his usual grace despite the circumstances. The soup was perfect, the wine excellent, but nobody seemed to notice. All attention was focused on the kitchen door, waiting for the main course that everyone knew was coming. When Fritz finally appeared with the risotto, the silence in the room became absolute. 6 plates of golden, perfectly prepared risotto alla Milanese, fragrant with the unmistakable aroma of premium saffron, were placed before us with ceremonial precision. Wolfe picked up his spoon and regarded his guests with the calm attention of a scientist observing specimens. "Please," he said quietly, "begin. It would be a shame to let such excellent saffron grow cold." Nobody moved. 5 pairs of eyes stared at their plates as if the risotto might suddenly sprout fangs and leap at their throats. "Interesting," Wolfe murmured, taking a deliberate spoonful. "You all seem reluctant to eat a dish that officially killed no one, since Mr. Ashford's death was ruled natural causes. Why is that?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Someone at this table knew exactly why they were afraid to eat, and that knowledge was about to destroy them. The evening's real business was about to begin. The silence stretched for a full 30 seconds, thick enough to slice with a carving knife. Wolfe continued eating his risotto with the deliberate satisfaction of a man savoring both excellent food and the discomfort of his guests. I took a bite myself. Fritz had outdone himself despite the circumstances, but kept my eyes moving, cataloguing the frozen tableau around the table. Marcus Webb broke first, shoving his plate away with enough force to rattle the crystal. "This is insane, Wolfe, or you're torturing us with our own fear." "Fear of what, precisely?" Wolfe inquired, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "The police ruled Mr. Ashford's death natural causes. If you believe this risotto is dangerous, you must possess knowledge the authorities lack." Dr. Vance picked up her spoon, examined the golden contents, then set it down with scientific precision. "As a trained chemist, I cannot consume a substance I suspect to be contaminated without proper analysis. That is prudence, not guilt." "And yet," Wolfe observed, "you have no hesitation eating in restaurants, despite having no knowledge of their ingredient sources or preparation methods. Your sudden caution suggests specific knowledge of contamination." He turned his massive head toward James Ashford, who was staring at his plate as if it contained live scorpions. "Mr. Ashford, you claimed financial desperation drove you to beg your uncle for assistance. His death made you his heir. Surely that resolved your difficulties." James's voice came out as a croak. "I inherited debts, not assets. Uncle Victor was leveraged to his eyeballs. The estate's worthless." "Interesting. Then you gained nothing from his death except the elimination of a man who had refused to help you." Wolfe's gaze shifted to Webb. "Unlike Mr. Webb, who stands to profit substantially from the partnership dissolution." Webb's face flushed crimson. "I was sitting at that table when Victor collapsed. Ask anyone." "Indeed, but you were not sitting there when the poison was administered." Wolfe rang the small bell beside his plate. Fritz appeared instantly. "Clear the table, Fritz. Now we will take coffee in the office." As we moved to the office, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The guests arranged themselves in the available chairs like pieces on a chessboard, each trying to position themselves as far from the others as possible. Wolfe settled behind his desk with the deliberate care of a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "We will now discuss Tuesday evening with complete candor," he announced. "The time for evasion is past." He opened his desk drawer and withdrew several items. The saffron jar Helen had brought him, a small glass vial, and a manila folder. Mr. Ashford died because someone replaced critical elements of his daily routine with colchicine. This required intimate knowledge of his habits, access to his apartment, and possession of the poison. Wolfe unscrewed the saffron jar and poured a small amount onto a white sheet of paper. "Miss Carstairs brought me this evidence, claiming it was the contaminated saffron from Mr. Ashford's kitchen. She also provided laboratory analysis, confirming the presence of colchicine." He dropped a pinch of the threads into a small bowl of warm water Fritz had provided. We watched as they dissolved, releasing their characteristic golden color. "Genuine saffron," Wolfe pronounced. "Not colchicine. The substance in this jar is completely harmless." Helen Carstairs went rigid in her chair. "That's impossible. The lab report—" A report you commissioned from a laboratory of your choosing using a sample you provided. Wolfe opened the manila folder. I had Fritz test this saffron yesterday, and I also had Saul Panzer investigate the laboratory you claimed to use. They have no record of testing any saffron sample in the past month. The color drained from Helen's face. Around the table, the other guests stared at her with dawning comprehension. "But why would she fake the evidence?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because Miss Carstairs needed to control the narrative surrounding Mr. Ashford's death. She knew suspicions were beginning to form. By hiring me and providing false evidence pointing to contaminated saffron, she hoped to direct attention toward the dinner guests and away from herself." Wolfe picked up the glass vial. "The real murder weapon was much more elegant. Dr. Vance, this is the colchicine that was stolen from your laboratory. Not powder, but tablets. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge crushed some to create the fake saffron evidence, but used the rest for the actual murder." "How?" Webb demanded. "By replacing Mr. Ashford's heart medication with colchicine tablets of identical appearance. Mr. Ashford took his medication twice daily, morning and evening. The evening dose, taken just before dinner preparation, would have begun affecting him within an hour, mimicking the symptoms of cardiac distress perfectly." I saw the pieces clicking together, and only someone with regular access to his apartment could have made that switch. "Precisely. Someone who visited frequently for business purposes. Someone who knew his medical routine and had observed him taking his medication." Wolfe's gaze fixed on Helen Carstairs like a searchlight. "Someone whose financial future depended entirely on their partnership continuing." Helen's hands gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles went white. "This is ridiculous. I hired you to investigate Victor's death. Why would I do that if I killed him?" "Because you needed to appear innocent while ensuring the investigation reached the conclusion you desired. You brought me contaminated evidence to analyze, knowing I would find colchicine and focus on the dinner party. You hoped one of the guests would be arrested, ending the matter permanently." "But I benefited from Victor's death," Helen protested desperately. "The insurance policy makes me look guilty." "On the contrary, it provides perfect cover. You knew suspicion would naturally fall on you as the beneficiary. By hiring me to prove your innocence, so you appeared to be seeking justice rather than avoiding it. It was a masterful psychological manipulation." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "However, you made several critical errors. First, you underestimated Fritz's palate. He detected the metallic scent in your fake evidence immediately, alerting me to the deception. Second, you assumed I would accept your laboratory report without verification. Third, you failed to account for Miss Rowan's observation." "What observation?" Helen asked, though her voice had lost all conviction. Lila Rowan spoke quietly. "I saw you coming out of Victor's bedroom Tuesday evening, when you claimed to be using the powder room. You had something in your hand, a small bottle. You slipped it into your purse when you noticed me watching." "His pill bottle," I realized. "So you were replacing his heart medication with colchicine tablets." Helen stared around the room like a trapped animal, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "He was going to destroy everything," she whispered. 20 years of work, my entire career, my reputation. He was planning to dissolve our partnership and start fresh with her." She glared at Lila with undisguised hatred. "He told me I was yesterday's news, that the food world wanted fresh faces and new ideas." "So you decided he should have no future at all," Wolfe observed. "He deserved it," Helen said, her voice gaining strength as her control shattered completely. "He used people like ingredients in his precious recipes, measured, combined, and discarded when they no longer served his purpose. And I gave him exactly what he gave everyone else, a carefully planned ending." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Webb had stopped blustering, staring at Helen with the horrified fascination of someone watching a confession to murder unfold in real time. Wolfe reached for the phone on his desk. "Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Miss Carstairs has a statement to make regarding the murder of Victor Ashford." As I dialed, I reflected that this case had been about more than murder. It had been about the violation of trust, the corruption of hospitality, and the bitter harvest of treating people as disposable commodities. Helen Carstairs had committed the perfect crime, except for one fatal flaw. She had tried to outsmart Nero Wolfe in his own dining room. That, as any regular visitor to the brownstone could have told her, was a mistake that no amount of planning could overcome. Inspector Kramer arrived 38 minutes later with 2 uniformed officers and the expression of a man who'd been pulled away from his dinner by inconvenient truth. He surveyed the office tableau with the weary resignation of someone who'd spent decades cleaning up after other people's cleverness. "Wolfe," he said without preamble, settling into the red leather chair. "Goodwin says you've got a confession and enough evidence to make the DA happy. This better not be another one of your theoretical exercises." "Miss Carstairs has admitted to murdering Victor Ashford by replacing his heart medication with colchicine tablets," Wolfe replied. "She will repeat this confession for your benefit, though she may request counsel first." Helen looked up from her chair with eyes that had gone flat and dead. "I want my lawyer." "Smart move," Kramer grunted, then nodded to his officers. "Take her downtown. Read her the rights. Get everything on record." He waited until they'd escorted Helen from the office before turning back to Wolfe. "Now suppose you tell me how you knew the medical examiner was wrong when he saw no reason to question natural causes." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "Because Miss Carstairs made 3 critical errors. First, she provided laboratory evidence that was too perfect. Genuine saffron contaminated with colchicine, complete with professional analysis. When I had Fritz test the sample, it proved to be completely harmless. The laboratory report was fabricated. She faked the evidence to control the investigation's direction. Second, she violated my orchid rooms to deliver a threatening note, believing intimidation would make me more pliable. Instead, it guaranteed my complete attention to every detail of her deception." Kramer pulled out his notebook. "And the third error. She underestimated Miss Rowan's observational skills. Miss Rowan witnessed her emerging from Mr. Ashford's bedroom with his pill bottle, which she had just finished tampering with." Dr. Vance stood slowly, gathering her dignity. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Wolfe. I genuinely believed you might be working with Helen to frame me." "Your suspicion was rational under the circumstances," Wolfe acknowledged. "However, your warning about Mr. Webb's bribery attempt confirmed my theory that Miss Carstairs was orchestrating multiple deceptions simultaneously." Marcus Webb cleared his throat, his usual bluster entirely absent. "So, none of us were actually guilty. You were all plausible suspects until Miss Carstairs' elaborate deceptions became apparent," Wolfe replied. "She needed viable alternatives to ensure someone else would be arrested when the investigation concluded." The remaining guests departed quickly after Kramer finished collecting their contact information for formal statements. Lila Rowan paused at the door, looking back at Wolfe with something approaching gratitude. "Thank you for finding the truth," she said quietly. "Truth," Wolfe observed. "It has a way of surfacing when lies become too elaborate to sustain." After the house emptied and silence returned to the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the kitchen with Fritz, who was methodically cleaning the unused dinner service with the careful attention of someone restoring order to a violated sanctuary. "The risotto was excellent," Wolfe told Fritz, "though it served a different purpose than intended." "No one ate," Fritz said sadly. "All that work, and the food went to waste." "On the contrary, it accomplished exactly what was required. It forced Miss Carstairs to reveal herself through her own carefully constructed lies." I leaned against the counter, watching Fritz restore his domain to its usual immaculate state. "Now, you knew from the beginning that Helen was lying about the contaminated saffron." "I suspected when she arrived with evidence too quickly and too conveniently organized. A genuine victim would have been more hesitant, more uncertain. Miss Carstairs presented laboratory analysis, detailed timelines, and perfect documentation. It was the work of someone controlling a narrative, not discovering a crime. Fritz finished covering the remaining food and turned toward us with renewed satisfaction. Tomorrow we return to normal meals, yes? No more drama with the risotto. Indeed, Wolfe said, rising from his chair with considerable effort. Archie, collect our fee from Miss Carstairs' attorney tomorrow. $25,000. As agreed. The fact that our client proved to be the murderer does not diminish our obligation to solve the case she hired us to investigate. As we moved toward the office, Wolfe paused in the hallway. She understood the chemistry of murder, but failed to account for human nature. She believed she could manipulate people as easily as she manipulated ingredients. That hubris was her undoing. Justice served with a side of irony, I observed. Justice, Wolfe corrected, settling behind his desk, served with proper attention to evidence and logic. Miss Carstairs discovered that deception, like cooking, requires more than technical skill. It requires understanding your audience. The case was closed, the killer identified, and order restored to the brownstone. In the morning there would be paperwork and legal proceedings. But tonight the orchids were secure, Fritz's kitchen inviolate, and Nero Wolfe's reputation for intellectual superiority intact once more. Some things, apparently, were more reliable than others. The silence that settled over the brownstone after Kramer and his officers departed was different from the usual quiet. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating tension that had plagued us for 3 days, but the comfortable, breathing silence of a house returning to equilibrium. The air no longer crackled with unseen threats. It simply carried the familiar scents of floor wax and Fritz's immaculate kitchen. I found Wolfe in the office, pouring beer with the concentration usually reserved for hybridizing orchids. He watched the foam rise with satisfaction, as if confirming that the natural laws of physics were once again operating without interference from murderous conspiracies. That was quite a performance, I said, settling into my desk chair. Though I have to ask, what if Helen had called your bluff and actually eaten the risotto? We'd have been stuck with a room full of innocent people and cold dinner. Wolfe drank, lowered his glass, and considered this. Unlikely. A poisoner who uses food as a weapon possesses a specific psychological profile, Archie. They are inherently distrustful of what they consume. They project their own treachery onto every meal. Miss Carstairs could not conceive of food that hadn't been tampered with because tampering was her primary mode of interaction with the world. Fritz appeared in the doorway, looking relieved, but still carrying shadows of the day's anxiety. "Mr. Wolfe, what should I do with the saffron Miss Carstairs brought? The tin she claimed was evidence." "Dispose of it," Wolfe ordered without hesitation. "Not because it contains poison. We know it does not. But because it is corrupted by intent. It was used to deceive. I will not have it in my kitchen." Fritz nodded with evident approval and disappeared toward the kitchen. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed in contemplation. She treated murder like a recipe, I observed. A pinch of false evidence, a dash of hired detective, stir until confused, and serve with a garnish of righteous indignation. Precisely. And like a mediocre cook, she over-seasoned the dish. Had she simply disposed of the pill bottle and remained silent, she might have succeeded. But her vanity required her to orchestrate her own exoneration. She wanted to be both chef and critic of her perfect crime. What about the others? Webb, Vance, James, Lila. Wolfe's expression turned thoughtful. They will survive their brush with suspicion. Mr. Webb learned that profit-seeking has boundaries. Dr. Vance discovered that knowledge without vigilance can be weaponized. Young Ashford found that desperation makes one vulnerable to manipulation. And Miss Rowan learned that accepting favors creates debts that may be collected in blood. He picked up his book, then paused. "Miss Carstairs forgot the fundamental rule of hospitality, Archie. A proper guest contributes to the table. She sought only to consume, Her partner's business, his life, his reputation. Such guests inevitably find themselves uninvited. And locked up, I added. Indeed. Murder by substitution reveals the deepest contempt. The belief that one's victim is so predictable, so controlled by routine that their habits can become their executioner. She turned Victor's trust in his medication and his love of cooking into instruments of death. That is why it offends me beyond the mere fact of murder. Fritz returned with a tray bearing sandwiches and fresh beer. "Duck pâté," he announced, "with cognac and black pepper. Since no one ate dinner." Wolfe nodded approvingly and took a sandwich. The case was closed, the killer identified, and order restored to our world. Outside, the city continued its eternal dance of crime and consequence. But inside the brownstone, the orchids were safe, the kitchen was clean, and Nero Wolfe was well fed. In our line of work, that constitutes a thoroughly satisfactory conclusion. 3 days later, the brownstone had settled back into its natural rhythms like a fine watch that had been briefly jarred and was now keeping perfect time again. Wolfe emerged from the plant rooms at 11 with the satisfied expression of a man whose orchids had forgiven him for the recent disruption to their sanctuary. I was at my desk sorting mail when Kramer called to report that Helen Carstairs had repeated her confession with counsel present, adding several paragraphs about artistic betrayal and the corruption of culinary integrity. The DA was pleased, the medical examiner was irritated at having missed a homicide, and the case was officially closed. And her attorney arrived an hour later with a certified check for $25,000, and the expression of someone who'd spent his morning explaining to a client why murdering business partners was inadvisable from both legal and practical standpoints. He didn't linger over pleasantries. The ripple effects continued through the afternoon. Marcus Webb called to announce he was restructuring his operations, which I translated as paying back taxes and hoping nobody examined his books too closely. Dr. Vance left a message that the missing colchicine had been logged as recovered, and she was revising her laboratory security protocols. James Ashford sent a note promising to join Gamblers Anonymous, along with a florist's card addressed to Lila Rowan. At lunch, veal with mushrooms, perfectly unpoisoned. Wolfe reflected on the case with the detached interest of a scientist examining a completed experiment. She confused murder with cooking, he observed, cutting his meat with surgical precision. Both involve transformation, but cooking nourishes while murder consumes. Miss Carstairs forgot this distinction and treated people as ingredients to be measured, combined, and discarded when they no longer served her recipe. She got the proportions wrong, I agreed. Precisely. Appetite is the most fundamental human drive, Archie. We hunger for food, success, recognition, control. When appetite becomes corrupted by contempt, when one begins to see others as mere components in one's personal feast, murder becomes inevitable. Fritz appeared to clear the plates, moving with his usual grace. And the violation of his kitchen had been purged, the proper order restored. New saffron had replaced the old, and the spice cabinet once again reflected his impeccable standards. After Wolfe departed for his afternoon session with the orchids, I sat in the office, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight. The guest who had left no plate had finally been served her just desserts, though not the kind she'd been expecting when she walked through our door with her carefully constructed lies. The phone rang, probably another case, another client with another problem that would require Nero Wolfe's unique combination of genius and gluttony to solve. I let it ring twice before answering, savoring the moment of perfect quiet in a house where order had been restored and justice had been served at the proper temperature. Outside, and the city continued its eternal dance of crime and consequence. Inside, the orchids breathed, the kitchen gleamed, and all was right with our particular corner of the universe. Some guests, as Wolfe had observed, inevitably find themselves uninvited. Helen Carstairs had learned this lesson in the most permanent way possible, and the brownstone was better for her absence. A week after Helen Carstairs was arraigned for first-degree murder, I found Wolfe in the kitchen with Fritz, examining a small wooden box that had arrived by messenger that morning. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like precious gems, was a collection of saffron threads so vibrant they seemed to capture sunlight in their golden strands. "From La Mancha," Fritz announced with reverent satisfaction, "the finest grade, and a gift from Miss Rowan with her thanks." Wolfe lifted a few threads, examining them with the attention most people reserve for diamond appraisals. She understands the principle of restoration. What was corrupted must be replaced with something pure. "Expensive gesture," I observed, watching Fritz carry the box toward his spice cabinet with the solemnity of a priest bearing sacraments. "Necessary one?" Miss Carstairs had poisoned more than Victor Ashford. She had contaminated the very concept of hospitality, turning the act of sharing food into an instrument of death. Wolfe moved toward the office with his usual measured pace. "This saffron will be used properly, without deception or malice. That is the appropriate response to betrayal." In the office, Wolfe settled behind his desk where the check from Carstairs' attorney had already been deposited in the safe. He opened a new book, a treatise on medieval spice roots, but before beginning to read, he looked up with something approaching philosophical reflection. "The case troubled you," he observed. "It did," I admitted. She sat right there in the red chair and played the grieving partner while holding evidence of her own crime. Then she tried to manipulate you into being her unwitting accomplice. That takes a special kind of arrogance. Not arrogance, Archie. Solipsism. Miss Carstairs suffered from the delusion that other people exist only to facilitate her ambitions. To her, Mr. Ashford was not a man with preferences and passions, but merely an obstacle to be removed, like a bone from a fillet. I swiveled my chair to face him fully. She was the guest who left no plate because she never really joined the table. She just poisoned the pot and stood back to watch. Precisely. Hospitality requires mutual exchange. The host offers, the guest accepts and contributes. Miss Carstairs sought only to consume. Such parasitic behavior is inherently unstable. Wolfe reached for his beer glass. She believed she could curate reality as she curated her spice blends, controlling every element to achieve her desired outcome. She failed to realize that reality, unlike a recipe, refuses to be contained in a jar. Fritz appeared in the doorway, carrying a silver tray with his usual grace restored. "For this evening, sir," he announced, looking happier than he had all week. "Since the saffron risotto was compromised, I've prepared something simple, a clear consommé with chervil, to wash away the bad taste." He placed the bowl before Wolfe. It was crystal clear, steaming slightly, the essence of purity made liquid. "Excellent," Wolfe murmured, picking up his spoon. "You see, Archie? Complexity is admirable, but clarity is essential. Miss Carstairs tried to muddy the waters with fabricated evidence and layered deceptions. She forgot that eventually sediment settles and truth remains visible. And now she's dining on state-sponsored bologna," I added. "A menu she will find distinctly unpalatable." Wolfe began to eat, then paused. "Appetite, Archie, is what separates us from machines. We hunger, we crave, we desire. But when appetite becomes divorced from gratitude, when we consume without acknowledging what nourishes us, we become parasites rather than participants in the great feast of existence." The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, painting everything in amber light. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos of ambition and appetite. Inside the brownstone, order prevailed. The orchids thrived in their controlled environment upstairs, Fritz's kitchen operated with restored perfection, and Nero Wolfe sat enthroned behind his desk, master of his domain and satisfied with the universe's current arrangement. "Justice served," I said, "with proper seasoning." "Indeed. And now we return to more civilized pursuits." Wolfe lifted his spoon again. "Fritz's consommé, for instance, She requires no investigation beyond appreciation. The guest who left no plate had been permanently removed from the table. The saffron had been replaced, the brownstone's sanctity had been restored, and somewhere in the city, people were sitting down to meals prepared without poison, served without deception, and consumed without fear. In our line of work, that constitutes not just a satisfactory conclusion, but a small victory for civilization itself.